A comprehensive look at what changed in pigeon racing, the what, why, when and how we can manage the changes. It's a bit of an epic, so grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and enjoy the ride. Young bird sickness. For thousands of years pigeons survived and thrived in its natural environment. It was only relatively recently that humans exploited its ability to navigate home. It coexisted with viruses, bacteria, and funguses which all live on and inside the pigeon, performing for the pigeon vital functions, for example breaking down its food in the gut, extracting the vitamins, minerals, trace elements and nutrients to support its host. It also provides defenses to protect the pigeon from invaders, bad bacteria, viruses and funguses, to keep the pigeon healthy in the form of an immune system. This natural immune system is weakened by physical injury, chemical, any substance that is not recognized to the pigeon, or emotional, taking it from its environment into a different one, which is known as stress. Pigeons could cope, including young birds, with the stresses of racing up until very recently, till around the late 1970s, early 80s, when the modern global sharing of information through the internet and consumer products boomed across the world. For the pigeon world, this brought in an influx of medicines, supplement products and new practices. These were readily adopted by fanciers offering the dream of having healthy winning pigeons. These new introductions have become common practice, growing steadily over the years, including the sales and exchange of birds across the country as well as from different continents, bringing with them new diseases. But as we established earlier, any chemical assimilated into the host, in our case the pigeon, upsets the gut flora, thus in turn reducing the immune system, especially on young vulnerable pigeons, leaving them open to disease. I don't blame one single product or practice, but rather a combination of these. I liken it to the saying, the straw that broke the donkey's back. In other words, the donkey could manage carrying a certain amount of the straw and perform well, but if overloaded by the final piece of straw, the donkey would collapse. It's a similar situation in our young birds. This is where we should look at ourselves, because we are the ones that facilitate this situation, because we are the ones that administrate the foreign bodies into our birds directly by mouth or the skin or through the medium of the food, water or intravenously. We are also the ones who impose the unnatural practices on our birds. Here's a few of the practices we have adopted, and I will explain the what, why and how they are adding to compromise your young bird's health, leading on to it being sick. Example. The what, breeding off parents that are not healthy. The why. Unhealthy parents cannot raise healthy squabs. The how. For a couple of reasons. 1. Using modern lighting to fool nature and your birds to breed in an unnatural season. 2. Preventative medication given to parents' pigeons before breeding. 1. There's a reason why our pigeons naturally breed in spring, March, April and May, and summer, June, July and August. It's because our pigeons know that this is the time when their offspring have the best chance of healthy growth and survival. Because of the supportive environment, abundance of food and daylight, as well as themselves being at their optimal health. The food, we as the fanciers can mitigate this because we can provide this in abundance. The natural daylight we cannot. Yes, we can fool them with artificial lights, but it comes at a cost. Here's a couple of reasons why. In spring and summer, pathogens, viruses, bacteria and funguses are at a minimum because of the sun's position in the sky. The UVA, UVB and near rays are at their strongest, which reduces the prevalence of disease caused by the pathogens. Also, the sun provides our pigeons with vitamin D3 boosted by near-infrared, strengthening the pigeon's natural immune system. All this is missing when you use the unnatural methods of breeding in winter using artificial lights. Put simply, the use of artificial lights for breeding in winter weakens the young bird's immune system. 2. Giving preventative medication to the parent birds before breeding. This practice defies logic because by giving medication to a healthy bird, as I've explained above, actually causes the parent bird to become vulnerable to disease by upsetting the delicate balance of the bird's gut flora, which in turn weakens the bird's immune system. But there's more. This then restricts the squab having an optimal immune system because the parents can only pass on what is left of its own immune system. Example. The what? The darkness system. The why? For a couple of reasons. Altering the bird's circadian rhythm. speeding up the bird's maturity. The how. Both reduce the young bird's immune system. The why. The circadian rhythm is nature's way of controlling, in our example, the pigeon's body clock. When to be awake, use energy, or sleep, rest and repair. It controls these essential bodily functions by the release of hormones and chemicals from the pineal gland in the brain. It is stimulated by daylight and darkness through the medium of the eyes, releasing melatonin at the correct time when the body needs them. Alterations in this natural rhythm leads to inflammation and a dysfunctional immune system, leaving the host vulnerable to disease. I'm sure you have heard fanciers saying my darkness young birds are like yearlings. Well, there's some truth in this. I'm sure you will know that childhood is a time for growth, learning and development. Well, this doesn't just mean physically in its outward looks, this also means internally in its immune system. This is true in our pigeons. This time is also crucial for the growth of its immune system, as it stops the physical components that facilitate the immune system when it reaches maturity. In other words, if you reduce the time for a young bird to grow by force unnaturally, i.e. using the darkness system, it comes at a cost of an underdeveloped immune system. There are studies in young chickens which show that by the use of artificial lights against natural light timings, it weakens the immune system by reducing the growth of the finger-like protrusions, villi, in the lining of the gut. These protrusions are essential to a healthy immune system. This study shows a process not that dissimilar to the darkness system in pigeon racing. These are just a few examples of what you do as a fancier that weakens your pigeon's immune system, leaving them vulnerable to disease. The point I'm trying to make is, if you know the difference between natural and unnatural and what helps your pigeons to be healthy and what makes them unhealthy, you can make an informed decision when it comes to your practices. Young bird losses. I think we can all agree that the most important factor in our racing pigeons is its ability to return home. It should be the most important consideration over everything in racing pigeons, as it is the primary reason there is a racing pigeon sport. Yet we the fancy don't seem to nurture it anymore and have very little knowledge on how to do it. Well, let's have a look at it in some detail and learn what we can from what is already known about it to improve it to at least back to where it should be. Here's a brief history on the rock dove, what we now call a pigeon. We can trace pigeons back to 23 million years ago because of fossil remains being found in France. The next time we hear about the pigeon is approximately 6,000 years ago, when the Persians and Sumerians in what is known now as the Fertile Crescent in and around modern-day Turkey, Iran, Iraq, Syria, Israel, Jordan, and the northern easternmost part of Egypt, where the pigeon was used to carry messages to and from battles. Moving forward to the 19th century, companies had been using successfully pigeons to send and receive messages, but with the advent of the telegraph and later the telephone, this practice became redundant, leaving surplus messenger pigeons, from which the modern-day racing pigeons were created by selecting the best messenger pigeons and breeding them together. This took place in Belgium and England simultaneously, and the first recorded race took place in Belgium in 1818, and pigeon racing has continued to the present day. So what was the point in learning this history? Well, we have established that the pigeon has managed itself for thousands of years with minimal interventions by the fancier, both in keeping itself healthy and keeping its homing abilities intact. As stated above, it was only in the 1980s when the decline started, with the advent of the promise of a dream, that the health and the homing instinct was affected. Let's take a look at what we do know about the pigeon's homing instinct. Luckily, there has been lots of studies done on this subject, and it is still classed as a mystery even though the physiology is well known. We know that the pigeon uses the Earth's magnetic field. We also suspect that the pigeon has a putative magnetosensory ferromagnetic structure located in the upper beak. The latest study on this subject agrees with this, but more studies need to be done. We do, however, know that signals from the ferromagnetic structure travel along ophthalmic trigeminal nerve to the hippocampus, the area responsible for spatial awareness and memory in the brain, after traveling through the trigeminal ganglia junction. We also know that there are 3 other areas sending signals to the brain which have been shown to be responsible for the pigeon's homing instinct, which are the optics, eyes, auditory, hearing, and olfactory, smell. It has been proven in studies that if the ophthalmic trigeminal nerve is cut and the signals are disrupted, the bird's ability to orientate is weakened. My hypothesis is that from a weakening of the immune system caused by stress to the racing pigeon by either one or all of the stress factors, physical, chemical or emotional stress induced by the fancier's practices, activates the dormant herpes virus, CoHAV1, that resides in the trigeminal nerve junction ganglia between the receptors and the brain, causing inflammation and weakening the signals, thus restricting the young pigeon's ability to orientate home. I also propose that the reason some young pigeons do return is that the herpes virus, CoHAV1, infection is at different stages of its infection at its time of liberation, thus groups of young pigeons have varying degrees of their homing abilities intact. Fat eye, to give it its real name herpes eye, is only an outward sign of what is happening inside your pigeon with the immune system. This then would account for why some young pigeons return home and some are lost. Let's take a closer look at the herpes virus CoHAV1 and why I theorize it is the main offender in young bird losses. Firstly, herpes CoHAV1 is the most common virus in birds, which includes pigeons. In a study done in Belgium in 2019, over 80% of racing pigeons tested by PCR tested positive for the virus. This then shows that herpes virus CoHAV1 is enzootic in our racing pigeons, which means in a practical sense we have to accept this situation, and rather than fight against it, we must manage it. The way to do this is by having an in-depth knowledge of this virus, its life cycle and its modus operandi, the way in which something operates or works, as well as a particular way or method of doing something. How do pigeons contract this virus? Close contact with an infected bird. Passed to the squab from an infected parent. Contaminated food, communal eating. Contaminated water, communal drinking. Inhalation of virus-containing dust derived from feathers, nasal excretion, saliva, nasal discharge, urine, feces, and crop milk. The symptoms of the disease. It should be made clear that virus, once the bird is infected, may not show any signs at the time of exposure. This is because the virus can lay dormant, as I have described previously above. The virus is activated when the pigeon's immune system is weakened. It is at this point when the pigeon starts to shed the virus externally to others. This disease is difficult to identify because of the different ways it presents itself, as it is dependent on the pigeon itself and mirrors other common diseases such as trichomoniasis, canker, pale yellow spots and stringy mucus in the throat, or respiratory diseases due to the disease progression to the lungs, and of course one-eyed cold, as mentioned previously, fat eye, herpes eye. Because of its presentation and dependent on the outbreak severity, young birds become lethargic, fluff up their feathers, retain corn in the crop, leading to green watery droppings, which could then put this disease into the category of young bird sickness, which, as we know, young bird sickness is a coverall name for numerous bacterial and viruses disease progressions. Mortality rates also are varied from a couple to tens of. Again, this is dependent on the strength of the bird and the severity of the outbreak. It must be noted that the fat eye symptom birds recover. A good indicator that your flock is heading towards the disease progression outlined above is the first obvious outward sign, which is fat eye, as pigeon fanciers call it. To give it its real name, it's called herpes eye. This is a single swollen eye which tells you that the CoHAV1 virus is located in the trigeminal ganglia junction on this side of the bird's head. This pigeon separated, left untreated, rested, given corn and water, the physical eye symptoms should resolve in 14 days without treatment. But I would speculate that this one pigeon may be the canary in the coal mine regarding the virus's stage in the rest of the flock. And this could account for why, especially in young birds, that they fail to return from the race, but also logic suggests that because of the mixing of other fanciers' birds in the race panniers, that they may have passed the virus to them. Thus why we are seeing more and more of young birds not returning from the races. Treatments for herpes virus CoHAV1. There is a combination paramyxo herpes vaccine, and from the reports I've read, some professionals are for it and some against its benefits to CoHAV1 virus. The antiviral drug acyclovir has been shown to be effective on some strains of herpes viruses with single bird treatment, but it also can have severe side effects, particularly on the kidneys. This should only be used alongside veterinarian support after a positive diagnosis has been established. Herpes virus cohavi-1 mainly affects young birds, but it's not exclusive to them, as older birds can become susceptible, but this is rarer as they have reached maturity in their immune system. From this information on the disease, it is obvious to see that we, the fanciers, and the birds have to live with this disease, and the only option is that we manage it. So how do we do this? Well, we know that this disease lays dormant and only becomes active when the immune system is weakened. We know that this disease is more active in young birds. We know that it is only relatively recently that this disease has become more common. We also know that it's relatively recently that the abundance of medications have become more common and new practices have been adopted. We now know that medication and the fanciers' practices weaken the immune system, and depending on how many of these practices we adopt and the severity of the reduction in the immune system it has is dependent on whether you activate the virus or not. This answers the question why some fanciers' birds get sick and some fanciers don't. The same principle is true why some fanciers' birds get lost and others less so. We are at a point with our racing pigeons' health where we really need to understand more about how the biology and physiology of our birds and how it impacts on their health and well-being, especially in young birds, but also for all age groups. What I am going to share with you is the latest scientific medical knowledge that has only really been confirmed and developed on in the last 20 years. Admittedly, there's not a lot of studies done on pigeons, but enough to reasonably prove that it is the same case in our pigeons as it is in other species. This new phenomenon is collectively called the microbiome. So here's a description and a brief history for your understanding. The microbiome is the microorganisms in a particular environment, including the body or a part of the body. We depend on a vast army of microbes to stay alive. A microbiome that protects us against germs, breaks down food to release energy, and produces vitamins. The microbiome is made up of bacteria, funguses, and viruses. The first bacteria was identified to have existed 3.5 billion years ago, the first virus 310 million years ago, and the first funguses were 1 billion years ago. So you see, they have been around a very long time, long before humans, animals, and birds. They live with us in a symbiotic relationship, living together. Without one there would not be the other. Humans, animals, and birds are just their host. But don't worry, we are not going into any more detail about them at this time period. We can move a lot closer into the 19th century with microbiologist Louis Pasteur, who invented pasteurization, which was a process of using heat to kill bad bacteria which caused disease in contaminated milk. This then was the first battle in the war against bacteria, funguses, and viruses. Later in 1928, Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin, which led to the development of antibiotics. It must be noted that antibiotics have saved countless lives in the Second World War and in the public, adding to the public's perception that it was good to kill germs. In all wars there are two sides, and on the opposite side there were two scientists, Professor Elie Metchnikoff and Dr. Joseph Brudzinski. Both are collectively known as fathers of probiotics. Ultimately, this academic scientific battle was won by Pasteur and Fleming, and the war against germs, as they called them, was readily adopted by mankind. We armed ourselves with disinfectants and antibacterials, indiscriminately killing the good and the bad bacteria which is in the air and all around us to our detriment. It wasn't until very recently, when the science became more advanced, that in 1995 the first microbial genome sequencing was completed and opened the floodgates into more research. In 2012, the Human Microbiome Project sparked even more interest, and more research was undertaken after the Human Microbiome Project found that the bacterial cell genes outnumbered the human gene cells by a ratio of 10 to 1, although more recent studies propose it to be 1.3 to 1. Which in real terms still makes us more microbial than human. Alongside all the latest findings in the world of microbes, there has been developments from the findings within the use of antibiotics and antifungals. The overuse and misuse of antibiotics in humans and animals has led to some bacteria becoming resistant to them. Also, new strains have evolved where conventional antibiotics have very little effect on some of the more common infections. Meanwhile, treatments using probiotics have shown positive results in areas of disease management, and studies have shown probiotics outperforming antibiotics to cure disease. So we now know that these new findings are forcing a new way of thinking, as it has now been established that supporting the microbiome with probiotics and prebiotics in disease prevention is favorable over treatment of disease. Because we have learned that microbes live all over the human body, both inside and out, with the biggest volume of microbes residing in the gut. The collective microbiome is made up of trillions of microbes, all of which have their own specific role in keeping the host, in this case humans, homeostasis, the tendency towards a relatively stable equilibrium between interdependent elements, especially as maintained by physiological processes, intact. An analogy often used is that the microbiome is comparable to a rainforest full of diverse creatures all living in its own ecosystem in balance. If that balance is upset by the removal of one species, then the opportunity for another species to fill the gap is made and a proliferation occurs. In other words, in the case of our pigeons, if the fancier actions upset the balance, for example, you give a chemical antibiotic, you create a gap in the microbiome bacterial species in the gut, which will be filled by another species of bacteria that will proliferate, which is what is called disease. So what have we learned from this? We now know that for billions of years microbes have been with us. We know that our pigeons for millennia have coexisted with the microbes, each performing vital life-giving tasks for each other, enabling them both to exist. For example, the pigeon gives the microbes a home and subsistence, food. We know that the pigeon is the host. We know that the microbes provides the mechanism to convert the food the pigeon eats into usable energy to keep it alive. We also know that it's the microbes that provide and facilitates the pigeon's immune system to protect it from other outside opportunist microbes to keep the pigeon healthy. We know that to have healthy pigeons, keeping this natural balance between microbes and the pigeon is crucial. These new scientific findings divert us from the path of all germs are bad and reinforce the thinking that all creatures, great and small, judged by us humans to good or bad, all have a role to play in nature's game of survival of the fittest. Which us humans with delusions of grandeur and godlike thinking think we know everything, when in fact we know nothing about nature's miraculous strategy and creations. Another point to note is the cost scenario around medication and supplements. As mentioned above, fanciers have literally bought into a dream. Fanciers have adopted a approach to their pigeons' health. By this I mean giving a third party money in exchange for a product they call a medication or a supplement based on trust. These are not cheap and can become a large part of the whole cost to raise pigeons. Take control, make a considered purchase after studying the cost benefits over the baseline of do nothing. So in summary, you must have noticed the elephant in the room, the word youngbird. Yes, youngbird sickness, youngbird losses. We are pushing our young birds to their breaking point with our interventions. Through the use of medications and our practices, which is affecting their health, thus affecting the basic homing abilities by not letting them mature naturally to become strong. I don't mean strong in body and looks, I mean in their immune system. It leaves them vulnerable to viruses, bacterial and fungal infections. I must make it clear, I am not against medications. They play an important role in our pigeons when they are used correctly. What I am against is the mis- and overuse, especially as outlined above in the preventative capacity. Also being administered by fanciers that think it is an easy way to success and not understanding the cause and effects of their actions. In other words, don't just look at the possible benefits, also look at the possible negatives. It's an old saying but still true today, you won't find success in a bottle. Similarly, I am of the same opinion on our practices. I agree, undoubtedly there are some great benefits. It's just about how you balance the pros against the cons in keeping the pigeon's health intact by keeping the immune system strong. Young birds are the fancier's investment for their future old bird racing. Have a little patience and nurture them, educate, yes, but leave the serious racing to the old birds that are more resilient to the stress. Don't look to others or other things to blame. It's a bitter pill to swallow, pardon the pun, but the problems are closer to home. So take a long hard look in the mirror. You just might find our sport becomes more enjoyable and less expensive. Remember, medication treats illness. Medication on healthy pigeons causes illness. Break this cycle. A pigeon without a homing instinct is just another bird. I must make it clear that I am not a veterinarian. I am, however, passionate about racing pigeons and sharing my lifetime's knowledge and experience with others to hopefully make their experience as wonderful as mine. Yours in sport, Dave Bunker Briley.